This is a homily for Easter Sunday. The Gospel for the Easter Vigil comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 28, verses 1 to 10. The Gospel for Easter Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 20, verses 1 to 9. As an alternative, the Gospel of St. Matthew may also be read at the Easter Sunday Mass. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. A synopsis of the four Gospels enables readers to see at a glance the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John arranged side by side in parallel columns. Similarities and differences between the four Gospels become immediately evident. This enables us to discern clearly the distinct perspective and emphasis of each evangelist. So, for example, a synopsis lays out in parallel columns the two episodes that we hear in today's Gospel: the women at the tomb and Jesus appearing to the women. The first thing that we notice is a general agreement about the time the women came to the tomb. Matthew tells us it was after the Sabbath toward the dawn of the first day of the week. Mark has when the Sabbath was past. Luke has the first day of the week at early dawn. Finally, John has on the first day of the week. Which women go to the tomb? Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark has Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke tells us it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them. John mentions only Mary Magdalene, but notice the use of we in John chapter 20 verse 2, which suggests that Mary may have had companions when she went to the tomb. Why did the women go? Matthew tells us that they went to visit the sepulchre. He suggests that they are coming to mourn, to remember, to grieve. Mark says they brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. In Luke, the women also bring spices which they had prepared. John simply says that Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. None of the women is expecting the resurrection. In fact, the women in Mark and Luke are coming to anoint a dead body. In Matthew's Gospel alone, we are told that there came a great earthquake. The ground shook at Jesus' death. Now it shakes again at his rising. Matthew does not mention the earthquake simply to heighten the drama. He includes it to show that what has happened at the tomb is an act of God that shakes the world. In Scripture, the earth trembles when the Lord draws near. In the book of Exodus, we're told that Mount Sinai shook violently. The Psalms speak of the earth trembling at God's presence. Matthew places that sign both at Jesus' death and at his resurrection. The cross and the empty tomb belong to one great act of God. The sealed tomb, the heavy stone, the armed guards, all signs of human control and finality, are undone in a moment, not by human effort, but by divine power. The earthquake tells us, in Matthew's simple but vivid way, that God himself is at work here, and that what seemed settled and final is not the last word. Matthew tells us that an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and rolled back the stone and sat upon it. In Mark's Gospel, the stone was already rolled back when the women arrived. They see a young man dressed in a white robe, presumably an angel. Luke also tells us that the stone was already rolled away from the tomb. The women see two men in dazzling apparel. In John's Gospel, the stone had already been taken away. When Mary Magdalene enters the tomb, she sees two angels in white. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the women are told that Jesus has been raised. Notice the passive, hegerthe, the aorist passive of egero, meaning to raise. It doesn't say he rose up, but he was raised. We have here an example of what scholars call the divine passive. It is a common biblical way of pointing to God as the one who acts, even though God is not specifically mentioned. The significance of the aorist tense here is that it presents the resurrection as a single, complete, and decisive event. Matthew tells us that the risen Lord appears to the women saying, "Greetings." He tells them not to be afraid. What do the women do? They came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Matthew portrays the risen Jesus receiving the kind of reverence that, in Israel's scriptures, is directed to God alone, thereby revealing Jesus' true identity. The women must tell his brothers that they are to leave for Galilee, for they will see him there. Before the resurrection, they were disciples. Now they are brothers, adelphoi. From the lips of the risen Lord, this message has an overtone of healing and reconciliation. The disciples who had abandoned him and fled are still his brothers. The scattered and terrified flock is to be reconstituted as the family of God, the nucleus of the church. In the earliest manuscripts that we have of Mark, there are no appearances of the risen Lord. The earliest and best manuscripts of the Gospel end at chapter 16, verse 8, with the women fleeing from the tomb, for trembling and amazement had gripped them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Chapter 16, verses 9 to 20 were added later and by another hand. In Luke's Gospel, the Lord does not appear to the women. In John's Gospel, the Lord appears to Mary Magdalene in the garden. So how do we explain these and a number of other differences between the four Gospel accounts of this episode? Theologian William Craig helps us make sense of these variations. The core of the story is the same. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body of Jesus, puts it in a tomb. The tomb is visited by a small group of women followers of Jesus early on the Sunday morning following his crucifixion, and they find that the tomb is empty. They see a vision of angels saying that Jesus is risen. The careful historian, unlike the philosopher, doesn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. He says, this suggests that there is a historical core to this story that is reliable and can be depended upon, however conflicting the secondary details might be. Journalist Lee Strobel suggests that it would be rather suspicious if the four accounts of the empty tomb agreed with each other in every detail. He writes, "Sometimes while covering criminal trials, I've seen two witnesses give the exact same testimony, down to the nitty-gritty details, only to find themselves ripped apart by the defence attorney for having colluded before the trial. Our knowledge of Alexander the Great rests chiefly on 4 surviving ancient biographies, all written centuries after his death in 323 BC, and none by eyewitnesses. Diodorus Siculus, late 1st century BC. Quintus Curtius Rufus, mid-1st century AD. Plutarch, late 1st century or early 2nd century AD. And Arian of Nicomedia, early to mid-2nd century AD. Although these biographies present markedly different and often irreconcilable portraits of Alexander, no historian doubts that Alexander himself existed. One of the striking features of the life of Jesus is how well it is attested by ancient sources. We possess a far greater number of early manuscripts and independent references for Jesus than for most figures of classical antiquity, and those sources stand much closer to the events they describe. The Gospels were written within living memory of Jesus' death, drawing on earlier traditions, eyewitness testimony, and communities that could still remember and challenge what was being proclaimed. Alongside them stand non-Christian references from Jewish and Roman writers, confirming key elements of the Gospel accounts. By contrast, for most ancient figures whom historians readily accept as historical, our sources are fewer, more fragmentary, and often written centuries after their lives, as was the case for Alexander the Great. Measured by the normal standards of ancient history, the documentary foundation for the life of Jesus is not thin or late, but unusually rich and remarkably early. Every historian knows that there will invariably be discrepancies when we have multiple sources for an event. For example, William Craig tells us that we have 2 narratives of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome, and they're incompatible and irreconcilable. Yet no classical historian doubts the fact that Hannibal did mount such a campaign. Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BC. In his book Archaeology, a very short introduction, Paul Bahn reminds us that it is not unusual to have significant discrepancies in the historical record. He offers the example of an event that occurred only 150 years ago, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This American battle was fought between Federal troops led by George Custer and Northern Plains Indians led by Sitting Bull. No one denies that the battle took place. However, Bahn tells us that all the surviving texts and eyewitness accounts concerning Custer's crushing defeat at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which took place as recently as 1876, are substantially different, not only in terms of what happened and how, but even in such basics such as numbers on either side. Where does this leave us? New Testament scholar Brant Petrie spells it out. The presence of differences in details in the various accounts does not mean that the resurrected Jesus did not actually appear to his disciples. To say so would be like claiming that the discrepancies between the eyewitness accounts of the sinking of the Titanic mean that the ship didn't actually sink. Michael Grant, historian and author of many books on ancient history, makes this observation. True, The discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. Let's now return to the women at the tomb on Easter Sunday morning. What do the women do after leaving the empty tomb? Matthew tells us that they ran to tell the disciples. The Lord had instructed them to tell the disciples that they must leave for Galilee. In Mark's Gospel, trembling and fear gripped the women. They say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Luke tells us that the women reported back to the 11 and to all the others, but their story seemed like an idle tale, and they were not believed. John tells us that Mary Magdalene came to the disciples with the message, "I have seen the Lord." All four Gospels agree that the empty tomb was discovered by women who were friends and followers of Jesus. What is remarkable about this is that in many strands of first-century Jewish culture there was little esteem for the testimony of women. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote, "From women let not evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex." William Craig tells us that women were on a very low rung of the social ladder in first-century Palestine. There are old rabbinical sayings that said, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to women," and "Blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." Women's testimony was regarded as so worthless that they weren't generally allowed to serve as legal witnesses in a Jewish court of law. This demonstrates a motif that resonates throughout Scripture, that those whom society thinks the least are often those whom God sends with his message. And the message is, the tomb is empty. Jesus has risen. However, the empty tomb by itself doesn't prove the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Matthew's Gospel is obviously responding to accusations that the disciples of Jesus stole the body from the tomb by night while the soldiers slept. That is exactly what happened to the body of the famous actor Charlie Chaplin. Following his death on Christmas Day 1977, Chaplin was buried in the village cemetery at Cossières-sur-Vevey, near Lausanne in Switzerland. However, on the night of March the 1st, 1978, two unemployed car mechanics exhumed Chaplin's body and reburied it in a cornfield outside a nearby village. They then attempted to extort $600,000 from Chaplin's family for the return of the coffin. To prove that they had the coffin, the thieves provided a photograph of it prior to reburying it in the cornfield. When the coffin was eventually recovered, it was reburied in the same village cemetery from which it had been stolen, but this time encased in 2 meters of concrete. The point is, though, that when the empty grave was first discovered, no one suggested for a moment that Chaplin had risen from the dead. People rightly suspected foul play, that grave robbers had taken the body. The disciples of Jesus proclaimed that Jesus had risen from the dead not because of an empty tomb, but because their risen Lord had appeared to them. But what do we mean by resurrection? Well, let's begin by focusing on what we do not mean by resurrection. Firstly, when the evangelists write about the resurrection of Jesus, they were not claiming that he had simply come back to ordinary earthly life. That would be resuscitation, not resurrection. We have several examples of resuscitation in the Gospels. Jesus brings the 12-year-old daughter of Jairus back to life. He raised the widow of Nain's son back to life. And he raised his friend Lazarus from the dead after he had been 4 days in the tomb. Jesus raises all of these people to life, but eventually each of them dies again. Secondly, the disciples were not saying that Jesus' soul or spirit was now with God. Instead, they went around proclaiming the anastasis, a word that literally means a standing up again, from ana, meaning up or again, and histemi, meaning to stand. This is the standard noun used in the New Testament for resurrection from the dead, not for the soul apart from the body. This proclamation also stood in sharp contrast to the dominant Greek philosophical view, especially that associated with Plato. In Platonic thought, the body, soma, is a kind of prison, a temporary and restrictive shell that confines the true self. At death, the psyche, the soul, is liberated from the body, finally set free to return to the realm of what is eternal and immaterial. From that perspective, bodily existence is something to be escaped, not redeemed. The early Christian proclamation of anastasis could not have been more different. It did not announce the soul's release from the body, but the raising and transformation of the dead person as a whole. Resurrection was not the abandonment of the body, but God's act of giving new life beyond the grave. So, what does the resurrection mean? Let us turn to the Gospel accounts to see what is essential for understanding what the disciples were actually saying when they said that Jesus had been raised from the dead. First, the resurrected Jesus has a body. Jesus is not a ghost, not a vision, not a disembodied spirit. The post-resurrectional appearances of Jesus are understood in a bodily and physical way. In Luke chapter 24, verse 39, the risen Jesus says, "See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bones as you see that I have." Jesus then takes fish and eats it before them. There is also the invitation to Thomas to probe the hands and side of the risen Jesus, and the reference to a meal in John chapter 21 verses 10 to 13. And yet, this body is not simply restored to ordinary earthly life. It is transformed. He is no longer bound by the space and time laws of ordinary human experience. He appears and disappears. He is no longer bound by closed doors or familiar constraints. At times, he is not immediately recognized. The Gospels make no attempt to explain how this works. They simply hold the two truths together. The risen Jesus is the same Jesus who was crucified, real continuity, and yet his bodily life has been radically changed. This is exactly the distinction articulated by Paul in chapter 15 of his first letter to the Corinthians. He writes that what is sown corruptible is raised incorruptible. Resurrection, then, is neither a return to mortal life nor an escape from the body, but the body's transformation into a new form of life beyond the reach of death. The wounds remain visible, not as signs of failure or unfinished healing, but as the enduring marks of love freely given, showing that the risen Jesus is the crucified one and that suffering and death have been transformed in God's act of resurrection. So the risen Jesus has not discarded his human body like an old garment, but as we've seen, his body has been transformed. The risen Jesus stood outside the bounds of space and time, but by his appearances he touched the lives of disciples who were in space and time. This is where the question becomes personal. What turned frightened disciples into witnesses? What took a message that sounded impossible, "He has been raised," and made it something people were prepared to stake their lives on? The answer the New Testament gives is consistent. They did not merely cherish a memory, they claimed an encounter. They believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them. And when we ask for the earliest voice to say this plainly, we find it in Paul. In the first letter to the Corinthians, written around late 56 or early 57 AD, Paul tells us that he personally encountered the risen Christ. He writes, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" Later, in the same letter, in chapter 15, he writes, "For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Paul is citing a tradition he had earlier received, the eyewitness testimony of those who had seen the risen Lord, including the most prominent in the Jerusalem church. Paul names specific individuals to whom the Lord appeared: Cephas, or Simon Peter, the 12, and James. And he appeals to the eyewitness testimony of a large group of more than 500 people, many of whom were still alive when he was writing. In other words, Paul is presenting this as publicly known testimony, effectively saying to his readers in so many words, "You can check this out for yourselves. There are plenty of eyewitnesses still living. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you and tell you what they saw." Could such an appearance to over 500 people be an hallucination? American psychologist Gary Collins tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly aren't something which can be seen by a group of people. Neither is it possible that one person could somehow induce an hallucination in somebody else. Since an hallucination exists only in this subjective, personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. The combination of the empty tomb and the appearances of the living Jesus explain why the disciples regathered and committed themselves to spreading a very specific message, that Jesus Christ was the Messiah who died on a cross, returned to life, and was seen alive by them. They were prepared to proclaim this message without any payoff from a human point of view. In the words of J.P. Moreland, Professor of Philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology, it's not as though there was a mansion awaiting them on the Mediterranean. They faced a life of hardship. They often went without food, slept exposed to the elements, were ridiculed, beaten, imprisoned, and finally, most of them were executed in torturous ways because they were convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had seen Jesus Christ alive from the dead. What you can't explain is how this particular group of men came up with this particular belief without having had an experience of the resurrected Christ. There's no other adequate explanation.